Imagine you're President Jefferson. You have two major European powers at each other's throats, but they can't really attack one another directly. So what do? They start picking on a third party, in this case, you. And the fact that shipping is being disrupted is having a major effect on the United States. So President Jefferson has to come up with some kind of idea. He has to come up with something to try and fix the situation. And the plan he comes up with is, in a word, unconventional. In order to try and stop both the British and the French seizure of American ships, because remember, both sides are seizing American shipping at this point in time, Jefferson resorted to an embargo. His belief was that the only way to stay out of the war was to shut down shipping. And when I say shut down shipping, I mean everything. It wasn't simply that he wasn't going to allow the United States to trade with Britain and or France. No, we're talking about stopping all international shipping totally. This is really one of the worst ideas you could have come up with. Already you're having the effect of the British and the French. The effect of their fighting is having ripple effects throughout the American economy. Now we're going to essentially bring the economy to a standstill. The United States really relied on shipping at this time as the economic thread that really kept the nation afloat and kept the nation going forward. When Jefferson decided to put an embargo on everybody, he was essentially cutting off that last thread. It was his belief, however, like I said, that this was the only way to stay out of the war. Jefferson really believed that both Britain and France relied on American goods, that both Britain and France needed what America was able to deliver beyond anything else. He thought that the shipping that we could provide, that the goods we could provide them, were so important and so necessary that they would stop the seizure of the ships, that our threat of an embargo like this was going to make them stop and re-examine what they were doing. Drawback was, it was really the opposite. Okay, we really didn't have the manufacturing section of the country that we needed yet, and so we were still very dependent upon European goods. We were importing quite a bit of the finished goods from Europe still. Now, yes, we did have a great deal of agricultural supplies that we could send out, but when it came to the finished goods coming back into the U.S., we desperately needed Europe way more than they ever needed us. Plus, keep in mind that Jefferson's concern over a standing military meant that we still had a very weak Navy and a very weak Army. Remember, we talked previously about the little coastal patrol ships that he was so fascinated with. Those could not possibly have stood up to the Royal Navy in toe-to-toe combat. Plus, the military that we had, we couldn't have done anything even if we wanted to. If, in this case, we wanted to get involved in the war in any way, shape, or form, we were going to really lose out rather badly and rather quickly because we just didn't have the firepower, the materiel, the men, anything like that to stand up against either Britain or France. Now, it was the Embargo Act in late 1807 that would forbade the export of all goods from the United States to any foreign nation. Like I said, it was everybody. It wasn't just dealing with Britain and or France. No, we decided we were going to stop doing everything. Plus, it didn't matter whether they were transported in American or foreign ships. So it wasn't even that some other ship could come and pick up supplies from the U.S. and deliver them. We were not going to allow anything to be shipped. As a result of all this, we had deserted docks, rotting ships in the harbor. Jefferson's embargo ended up hurting the very same New England merchants he was trying to protect. The idea was to protect the ships from being seized. And while they weren't being seized, they were now stuck at harbor. So you had basically the same net effect when all was said and done. The ships were not being used, the shipping was not being done, and the economy was beginning to crumble. Commerce of New England was harmed a whole lot more than that of either France or Britain. So as Jefferson went through thinking that Britain and France desperately needed American goods, he was going to learn a very harsh lesson that it wasn't the case. It was, in fact, the opposite that we mentioned before. And New England, the commerce there was crippled. It was horribly hurt, much, much more than either of the other two nations. Farmers in the South and in the West, they were alarmed as well because now they had mounting piles of cotton, grain, tobacco, things that could not be exported. And what happens with something like that? Well, the grain and everything starts to rot. The cotton can get moldy. The tobacco becomes unusable. And as a result, the farmers were now concerned that they were going to lose everything as well. That it wasn't just the New England shippers, but it was the people who produced the goods that those ships then carried. As a result, Jefferson had gone through and he had upset the New Englanders, he had upset Southerners and Westerners. He had really gone through and not just upset the old Federalist base, but he'd upset his own base as well. And as a result, any time that you have a major embargo like this, illegal trade explodes on the scene. In 1808, people began smuggling again. And as we have talked about previously, Americans are really good at smuggling. We had done so under the Navigation Acts. We had done so when we were colonies, and we're going to be doing it again. This time, though, it's not just bringing stuff in and whatnot, but we're getting American goods, trying to get them to market overseas. The problem with all of this all came down to Jefferson's embargo. It was an off-the-wall plan, but it was not having any of the effects that Jefferson had anticipated. And so it was through all of this smuggling and the economic devastation and all these different issues that were going on at the time that eventually, finally, Congress came to their senses, okay? They were feeling the public's anger. And Congress has a tendency to listen to that a lot more closely because they're up for re-election every 2 years, whereas a president is only up for re-election every 4 years. So they repealed the Embargo Act on March 1st of 1809. Now, that's actually just 3 days before Jefferson ceases being president. And they replace it with something referred to as the Non-Intercourse Act, okay? That reopened trade with all the nations of the world. Everybody except France and England. So this could have been done at the outset. They could have set something up like this at the beginning, but that wasn't the way that Jefferson wanted it done. In fact, had he done that, probably the economy would have hurt, but not been nearly as bad, and maybe it would have changed the course of history. It's very hard to know. But even though they did go through and they did change all of this, this new act really had the same effect as the Embargo Act. America's number 1 and 2 trading partners were Britain and France, as I said. And as a result, that yes, they were able now to have much more trade going on with various nations around the world. But there was going to need to be a lot of trade to make up for that. Should we have chosen a different path? It's hard to say. We have a tendency to look at history with the benefit of 20/20 hindsight. We understand now what were the ramifications of various decisions. It is exceedingly difficult to know what is the right course of action right at that particular moment. And sometimes politicians, like every other human on the planet, can make a mistake. Thus, economic coercion continued from 1809 to 1812. And that would go on right up to the point that war actually struck. We were going back to war. This time, however, we were going to be the ones that actually started it. We had finally had enough. We thought we could handle pretty much anything, and we're about to find out, whether or not that's true. The embargo really failed for 2 main reasons. First and foremost, Jefferson underestimated the British. He thought that they were dependent upon American goods, that they required American goods to survive, and they did not. And 2, he didn't continue the embargo long enough or tightly enough to achieve success. Because it wasn't enforced tightly enough, there was the ability for people to smuggle. And smuggling undermined the entire concept of the embargo. Question about this, and even, Jefferson even admitted this to himself, that the embargo was 3 times more costly than war, could have built a stronger navy with a fraction of the money that was actually lost. Was this the right course of action? Jefferson saw it as such. But he did realize after the fact there were other ways. Jefferson had complained about the fact that the Federalists had spent money on a navy and things like that. Well, he realizes that the economy being shrunk or being damaged can oftentimes be just as devastating as an actual war. And in this case, that's exactly what he saw. It was during the time of the embargo that the Federalist Party actually started to regain some of its lost power. Now, the Federalists were never going to come back to their highlight again. They were never going to have another president or anything like that, but they did gain some stature. They did move forward in the eyes of some people. So that was a positive to them, especially at the cost to Jefferson. Politics was then as it is now. People oftentimes want to get even with their quote-unquote enemy on the other side of the aisle. Now, one of the weirdest things about the embargo was its unintended consequences. There were a number of things that Jefferson thought the embargo would do, and there were also some things that did happen that were far from his realm of thinking at that point. During the embargo, Americans were cut off from finished goods from all over the world, and as such, they had to figure out some other way in which they could go through and get those goods that they needed. And the only choice was to start to manufacture them on our own. So we had various factories that we would open or build, and we had to start making our own stuff. Now, Jefferson had wanted us to be an agrarian nation. He wanted us to be a nation of small farmers who would work their fields during the day and then at night would discuss politics with their neighbors. Alexander Hamilton, however, his arch rival, wanted us to be a manufacturing nation. And the embargo really pushed us further down the line of industrialization. We would eventually become a manufacturing nation that would overtake Great Britain. But we weren't there yet. This was just the beginning. But because of the embargo, because of the change we had to make just to get what we needed on a regular daily basis almost, had really, really committed us to the path of industrialization. Now, the embargo also did affect Britain. It was having an effect, and in all honesty, it might have worked had they held out for a little bit longer. There is no guarantee of that, but 2 days before Congress actually declared war, this was in June of 1812, London ordered the Orders in Council to be suspended. Had we known that, likely we would not have declared war on Great Britain. But you're about to find out that we went through and thought we were at a point where we could take on Britain, that we could defeat Britain. We sort of lost the fact that we hadn't done it alone in the Revolution. But this was a different time frame, and we thought we had this in the bag.